Hello, today I'd like to talk to you about isolated queen's pawns. There's one there. It's isolated, that's to say it's got no pawns either side of it in the C or E files. A queen's pawn in front of the white original start position of the queen, and it's one of the most common types of pawn structure that you get in chess. So that's worth knowing. It's sort of an attacking formation if you've got the white side of it, so that's worth knowing as well. And actually, if you're confused about all the many and various different sorts of chess defence that there are to the king pawn opening, it's not a bad thing to steer for, and actually to have it in your kit bag that this is a position that you know how to play for either side, and you know which sorts of positions are going to be good for you and which ones are going to be bad for you. That's very helpful, and I think it gives you some, and it will sort out actually a lot of playing in queen's pawn openings as well, if you fancy it. I'll just go through all the different variations that you could play that could give you an isolated queen pawn at the end of this video, or the second half of this video. But just for the moment, let's consider it in abstract. What sort of position is this? Where do you want your pieces? What's good and bad for either side? Well, before we start putting pieces on this board, we can say that the isolated queen pawn is an isolated pawn. It's not going to get defended by another pawn. That's to say, if it's attacked by a black piece, it's going to need to be defended by a white piece. So if we put a black piece on the board attacking the pawn, well, we're going to have a white piece somewhere defending it. And and if they're the only two pieces on the board apart from kings, well, then white is going to be passive, going to be defensive. The half of white's army is tied up defending a pawn, or all of their spare pieces are tied up defending a pawn. Now you can defend an endgame a pawn down, but this is not easy for white. We could make it harder for white actually if we took the knight away and put there a bishop. So it's not just that white's defending, actually it's defending with a piece that's the bishop is sometimes it's become a tall pawn. It's totally stuck defending the pawn, but it's got very little activity. It can't get to either side of the pawn, can't see past it, and has got little activity. So this is sort of the worst possible position for white. An endgame, in fact, with very reduced material, and the knight can hop about on the light squares. Can come to d5 rather happily, I would have thought, and be having even more influence in the centre. Can't be dislodged, and white is stuck with a defensive role. So this is kind of the worst endgame for a worst type of position for white, which is an endgame, which gives you a clue about the best sorts of positions for white. The best sorts of positions for white are with as many pieces on as possible. So it may be that you'll always have one piece, a knight or a bishop, stuck stuck defending the pawn there, but that's only one piece out of, well, you might have other pieces. So if you put your knights on sensible squares in the middle, you put your rooks on sensible squares in the middle, you put your queen on a decent square in the middle, and now yes, you have got one piece stuck attacking the defending the pawn. I keep saying attacking. You've got stuck defending the pawn, but your other pieces are free to attack. So, well, let's stick a bishop on the board pointing towards the black king. We can queue up our queen against the black king. Now we don't want the knight coming into b4 and attacking us, getting something off. We'll play a3. What else can we do here? Well, we can hop our knight into e5. I mean, yes, it can be swapped off from that square, but then we get a pawn into black's guts, and it might drive away an important defensive piece like the other knight. So we often find the Queen's knight actually comes to sit on d5, because one of the things that we're threatening to do, perhaps, if we've got all our pieces stuck in the middle and they're all sort of nicely active, then we might be able to break open the position and just win it on sheer activity. So that's not a bad idea for white. And lastly, if we can put our pieces in active positions and start to think about attacking, because of the extra space given by the isolated queen pawn, we can think about a rook lift, as it's known, moving the rook up to the third rank and across to the king's side. We've got more space with an isolated queen pawn, so we can move pieces around the board a little bit more easily. We can attack the king more easily. And so an isolated queen pawn is an attacking formation where you can use your extra space and your extra mobility, which is sort of the same thing, to attack the enemy king. And so you should. And I'll show you a game where that happens. Similarly, conversely, if you're black in this sort of position, defending against an isolated queen pawn, well, it would be nice to thin out some of those attacking possibilities, either by swapping off all the major pieces that we can, and so we're not going to get checkmated. And in fact, if we can reduce ourselves down to the endgames that we saw earlier, that's better for black. But any sort of swaps are likely to just take the wind out of the attack and help you, so that's good news. And so from a black point of view, I mean, there's a couple of games again I'll show you, one with just minor pieces and one just with rooks, and another one with more major pieces, where black can look forward to a win in this endgame. They say that one weakness, one isolated queen pawn, isn't enough to win the game, but it's surprising how often you start off with one weakness and you end up with another one. So to be avoided. Lastly, just I won't show you any examples of this, but the pawn structure that we see in an isolated queen pawn game can change. We often say to get this knight stuck on d5 ready to swap, and sometimes black might want to take on c3, take on c3. It's a swap, and then the isolated queen pawn stops being isolated, but black might have transformed their advantage in pawns to say, well, the isolated queen pawn on d4 was too hard to attack, but let's have a swap, and then we've got opportunities to occupy other squares on the chessboard, and with a different weakness, we might find ourselves with a better position than before. So something like this is a different pawn structure, one that often comes out of an isolated queen pawn position, and not too bad for black. White, if they can, should move the pawns side by side, so they're not as wholly, and they're still very cramping for the black position. Actually, they're more cramping for a black position than an isolated queen's pawn, and so they're called hanging pawns. They're sort of semi-detached, not isolated, but and the same themes apply. You've still got more space for the attack. You've still got a decent square for your knight on e5. You still should point your bishops at the king side, and black should try and slow you down by attacking the pawns and seeking exchanges. So those are the principles. Those are the ideas behind the isolated queen pawn. So let's look at some games. I'm going to whiz through 3 games today, one for the isolated queen pawn, 2 against. Each of these games is worth half an hour video each, and I don't know that I've got the patience even if you have today, but so I'm going to crack through 3 of them just to try and bring out the principles that I've talked about earlier in abstract. Here's a game between Mikhail Botvinnik and Milan Vidmar from Nottingham tournament in 1936. I always explain this Queen's Gambit position by saying white ought to play a move like rook to c1 or queen to c2 here, because what they don't want to do is to play, as you might expect, bishop to d3, because black might take on c4 and make you waste a move, because you spent 2 moves getting the bishop to c4 instead of one that you might. However, if you like a bit of clarity, as Botvinnik did in this position, that's exactly what he played, taking a little bit of pressure off the centre, so black hit back with c5, and now we had a transformed the pawn structure to get a classic isolated queen's pawn position, and this is one of the most famous games with an isolated queen's pawn. The bishop comes back to b3, having been attacked, so you can see already that black is trying to blockade and stop white moving forward on d5. Queen to d3, knight on b to d5, possibly a slight inaccuracy already actually. Knight on f to d5, and then we're swapping pieces, which is what black wants, although we are moving a piece away from the king side, which isn't necessarily what we want. Anyhow, knight on b to d5 was played, and now knight e5, the move that we wanted to play. There's no chance of it being swapped at the moment, and nice to get into that sort of square. Even if black could drive the knight away with the f6, that's not necessarily a move that they want to play, because it weakens the e-pawn and weakens the f7 square. So I'll just turn off all my Christmas decorations, and knight e5, bishop to c6, activating the bishop a little bit, rook a d1, knight to b4, and the queen comes, well, where would you put the queen? It went to h3, and clearly having some idea of attacking the queen side, sorry, the king's side, and well, let's look a little bit deeper about how that goes, why that might be a smart square for the queen. Bishop, if black plays a important move like a6, white's threatening knight takes f7 with advantage. The queen's going to come in, or the bishop is going to come into e6, so bishop comes into e6, two pawns and a rook for 2 pieces, which is to white's advantage, even if the king will accept being kicked around like that. So knight takes f7 is the threat, and if the king takes f7, again there's a mate and mayhem threatened with a move like queen takes c6 check. So knight takes f7 is the threat, so bishop to d5 blocks, and now white takes off the bishop. We don't want necessarily an exchange to exchange too many pieces, but that's a good bishop to get rid of. And now, although that was black's worst bishop, it's possible that without a light squared bishop defending the pawns on light squares, that might be a problem. I'm making these sort of general points, but you'll soon see how quickly they became very concrete, and you could actually see and feel the weakness of the pawns on light squares very quickly. Well, perhaps a little bit more quickly than you might imagine after a move like f4, c8, f5, and then immediately white is trying to lever apart those light squares. Queen to d6 was played, which is probably a mistake. And now with all of this firepower, looking at the f7 square, as it were, knight takes f7 happens anyway, rook takes f7, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, and now rook to d5. When that combination is a little cracker and worth playing through the variations, but for the moment we can see how white's extra mobility and firepower made a sacrificial attack possible like this, and now black's actually losing material because of this poor old Luke's rook on c8. Queen to c6 tries to cover most things, rook to d6, very cheeky, and now queen to e8 and rook to d7, piling up on the pinned rook on f7, and black resigned. So with an isolated queen pawn, attacking possibilities which you've got to pursue actually quite definitely, and get stuck in. So Botvinnik Wiedmar 36, how to play with an isolated queen pawn. That game's worth going over more than once. I'll stick it in the collection of games that are on the website. The next game I want to show you is between Korchnoi and Karpov from 1981, another very famous isolated queen's pawn game, and off we go from an English opening into a Queen's Gambit, and the way they play these days with bishop to e7, just putting off white from a variation that he might have wanted to play. And the system with rook to c1 was played. Normally you play that after e3, but Korchnoi is trying something a little different to start with. So d takes c4, e3 now, and black takes advantage of the odd move order from white to play c5. Takes, and well, taking on d4 with a knight is okay, but playing for a win, e takes, and moves that we might have seen before. Knight to h5 now, and that does swap off a pair of pieces. In this way, and black's thinking about blockading again on d5, bishop to b3. I mean, maybe something like knight e5 was better, and so black's got d5 well and truly covered. Bishop d7, rook c8. So white's still got attacking chances in this type of position. I mean, obviously black's manoeuvred fairly well to get to this far, and now white plays knight to e4. I mean, yeah, you've got to turn that mobility into attack if you can, but that's another pair of exchanges, another pair of pieces exchanged, which is not what white wants. And actually, after takes and takes, another pair come off. I mean, again, white could have played for a draw here with takes and just getting rid of the isolated d pawn, leaving not much left to play for either side. But instead of this, and again thinking about just trying to squeeze a win out of it, rook to c3, and undoubtedly that the position is now on the slide. Rook to d8 by black, and rook to b6. So black's trying to pin white's pieces down to defence, and having done that, now starts looking for another way to move forward. So offering more exchanges, and now probing for an extra weakness. I mean, it's hard to give white much advice here, but probably exchanging the last pair of minor pieces wasn't right. So we've got a major piece ending. I mean, you actually probably more often get minor piece endings in isolated queen pawn positions, but off we go. So that exchange has left white with a chance to make some more of a nuisance perhaps on the queen side. Black chooses to keep the queens on, in fact, rather than improve the white pawn position. And now here's an interesting moment, f4. In this position, obviously the d pawn is being attacked, and actually it's being attacked 3 times and only being defended twice. But there's a black b pawn that will drop off after swaps in the middle, and that's not so to white's disappointment if the d pawn disappears for a black pawn. So black not really anxious to take that pawn directly, but and again, if I'll take some of the colour off the board, that there's a further idea here for black, that the pawn behind this tripling on the d file, if this pawn wasn't in the way, then this rook on d1 is vulnerable, and so in fact a move like e5 is a threat in this position, and that really will pick up the pawn for nothing. So black is threatening e5, which is very common if you've got major pieces attacking an isolated pawn like this, and so white stops it with f4, and there we start to see how one weakness starts to become two. The white king side is now loose and much weaker than before. b6 covers that b7 weakness, b5, and white fancies some swaps perhaps, and off they go. And now the queen moves into a more active position, and we can, White's position has deteriorated quite a bit over the last few moves, and now, rather interestingly, e5 comes anyway, because after f takes e5, rook e5, the rook on the white rook on the d file is still vulnerable, and if takes on e5 here, rook takes d2, and if the queen comes to the second rank again, white's got all sorts of problems, and that's a very very difficult position for white to be in. So didn't take on e5 quite rightly, and instead came up with queen to a1, not a good square for a queen, to try and cover the last rank as well as everything else. Queen e8 from black, and now white did chop on e5, and obviously rook to takes d2. Now white's still got an isolated queen pawn. It's become an isolated king's pawn. It's an extra pawn. In fact, so sorry, not an extra pawn. It could have been an extra pawn, but not doing well there. There's the extra pawn. My apologies, I got ahead of myself. So we've got a position where white's got an extra pawn, but black's got a rook on the 7th rank in a position where the white king is not easily able to get any shelter, and that's what's decisive in the end. So black's transformed their advantage from a structural one about an isolated queen pawn to a dynamic one with a rook on the 7th rank. And this looks like good night nurse. The white tried to harass the black king, used the time to get the king the queen across to defend the king, and now offering the rook there, I see. Now why can't black take that? I'm guessing it's perpetual check. There we go. So queen f6 check, and so that's just a draw. So that's a smart move, that queen f1 move by white. So not so interested in the rook, but queen c5 check, king h1, queen d5 check. The queen, if the queen goes in the way, it's mate. If the queen doesn't go in the way, the rook will come to d1, winning. White resigns. So the quite a complicated and rich sort of game. Again, worth playing over slowly, but the themes are there. Weakness of the d pawn, and if it's not resolved, other weaknesses start to appear. Those two games are very striking and rich in a way that perhaps this next one is a bit more subtle. This is a game between Salomon Floor, Salo Floor as he was known, and Milan Wiedmar again. Poor old Wiedmar. He was one of the top 3 players of his day, and cracking organiser, but he only ever seems to turn up on my database as being kicked around as an example of how not to play chess. But he was a very fine player. I'll perhaps do him more justice with a different video. But so this is a position that ended up with an isolated queen's pawn, and we get a position here on move 29 in this game after another queen's gambit, where black's got an isolated, sorry, white's got a chances against the isolated queen's pawn, and black sees an opportunity. They think to swap off some pieces and perhaps move to a different structure, which they do. So I'll just showing you this other structure of so knight to c6, which looks like it loses a pawn, but rook to c8 doesn't lose a pawn, rook c5, but it does lead to this position I talked about with a transformation of the pawn position. So we've got these a couple of pawns that are semi-detached. I don't know if there's a proper name for them, but I'm going to call them semi-detached pawns. And now this position turns out pretty well for white. If you like, in fact, that we started off with one weakness on d5. Now actually white's got two weaknesses to go at, on c6 and a6, in a way that he didn't before, and with some slow, careful, unhurried endgame play here, white wins. Hard to see how they can improve their position here without a break. So there's a break, and now the white king might threaten to come in on the king side and invade. So trying to keep white out, but making some weakening pawn moves because of it. So trying to keep the king out, black has played this h6 move. So clearly white trying to poke their way in, and and now the pawn has advanced to g5. White comes back a bit and tries to think about how to get in, and now check, and invades with the rook, and check again, and so black was impatient and moved the c pawn up and has lost it, and now check, and now the white king is coming in on the king side of it eventually, as promised, and black's just lost. Rook f6 is decisive here. The h pawn is going to go either to the rook or to the king, and black's too slow with their counterplay on the queen side. So I thought that was just a nice interesting extract where we started with an isolated queen pawn position, and we've moved to a position where the structure changes but the weakness in the game remains. So that's how to play for and against an isolated queen pawn, and I'll show you some variations now where you might get these in your own games. So just quickly going to run through some variations which give you isolated queen pawn positions, and the point of this is expect them, but also if you like isolated queen pawn positions, or you feel you'd like to play one side or the other of them, you can steer for them deliberately. So there's particularly I think playing for as white in a king pawn opening, you can very deliberately steer for isolated queen pawn positions, and with the isolated queen pawn. The same for if you start with 1 to d4, although there's more complications sometimes. Let's anyhow, actual variations. French defence by black, d4, d5, and now e takes d5, e takes d5, c4. Sort of Monte Carlo variation, which we actually tried by Kasparov a few times in a slightly different move order. And if these pawns become swapped off, then the white e pawn becomes isolated, and then we have an isolated queen pawn position. So if that's an easy way to handle a French defence. If you can also try as black to steer for an isolated queen pawn position with c5. C takes d5, e takes d5, and again if these two pawns come off, then the black pawn will become isolated. Another line in the French defence I've seen pushed recently, bishop to d3, c5, c3, takes on d4, takes on d4, takes on e4, takes on e4, and again we've got an isolated D pawn. Little trap for the unwary. If you take the pawn as white, you're going to be sorry after bishop to b5 check. Don't do that. Lastly, the Sicilian defence, c5, plays c3. What I always used to call the Alapin variation, or Alpin variation, and sometimes named after Sveshnikov. But the c3 Sicilian, and knight f3 is a common line, e5, d4, takes on d4, and now if black plays d6 and we swap, we've got an isolated queen pawn again. That's not the best move order. This is just kind of the idea of what might happen to the pawn structure as the game goes on. So that's not necessarily recommending a series of moves for you, but I mean, obviously black's a bit ahead in development now. There's easier ways to make trouble for black than this, but the pawn structure could end up with an isolated queen pawn. After c3, d5, and again we have an isolated queen pawn position, another trap to fall into. Bishop to g4, bishop e2, and now if you fancy taking the pawn again as black, with d4, you're going to be sorry after bishop takes c6 check, so don't do that either. Playing e4, and meeting those semi-open defences, well, we've got several ways of steering for an isolated queen pawn zone. So rather than learning very different variations against the French, the Sicilian, the Caro-Kann, you're actually learning one structure which kind of holds the three together. So not a bad idea. After e4, e5, the Petrov defence, we play takes and takes. Important to play d6 first before you take back as black. But d4, d5, castles, and now white c4 is a common line, and again after a swap we're going to have an isolated queen pawn. You can head for it a little bit more directly after knight to f3, knight to c6, and now in the Scotch game, or variations like it, you can try the Goering gambit. Everybody calls this the Goring gambit. It's like the German commander in the war, Hermann Goering. And it rhymes with stirring and not boring. It's not a Goring gambit, it's a Goering gambit, I think. So Goering gambit, and if black declines with d5, takes, c takes d4, isolated queen pawn. So anyhow, point made, I hope. Lots of opportunities in the king pawn opening to get an isolated queen pawn, and they're all over the place in the queen's pawn openings. I mean, we just looked at one in the game Plotvinig against Wiedmar, and takes and takes, isolated queen pawn. If you're heading for one for black again, if you want to play isolated queen pawn positions for your side, and you're playing black, in this position don't play knight f6 but c5, takes on e5, takes on d5, and when these pawns come off, isolated queen pawn for black. So they're fairly easy. In the variations where black doesn't reply to d4 with d5, most of these positions don't end up with an isolated queen pawn, but the ones where you do are often in this line, the Rubinstein variation of the Nimzo Indian, and so if we play, actually I don't know these variations, I don't play them for white or for black, but I can imagine after some moves like these, and later exchanges by black in the centre. How would you play this? So c5, and after an exchange on d4, there's going to be another isolated queen pawn. And lastly, in the queen pawn games, if black takes on c4, The old ways of playing these lines were always to play them with an E3 move, and after knight F3, knight C6, sorry, not knight F3, knight F6, and E6, bishop takes, and bishop E7 maybe, castle C5. There's going to be exchange on D4 and another isolated queen pawn. There's what else is there? Oh, the dear old semi-Tarrasch defence, which leads to an isolated queen pawn quite often for white. It's just one way of playing. I'm not necessarily sure it's the best one. Knight C3, knight F6, and we'll play as white knight to F3, which is less pressure on the centre. C5 is the reply for black. Takes and takes. Now I expect the best move here is to play E4, but if that looks a bit sharp for you, E3, knight C6, and after something like bishop to D3 or bishop to D4, and an exchange on D4. Guess what? Isolated queen pawn. So very important, very common sorts of positions. You have to know them anyway, so get used to them. Actually, I used to know a guy called Eric Teichmann who always said his entire opening repertoire was based around avoiding isolated queen pawn positions. Well, don't do that. Get stuck in, get to enjoy them, get to play them well for either side. They'll crop up a lot, and you can make them the basis of your thinking about openings.